Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a trying time, to say the least. It's been a long few weeks, and we're excited to come together today just to have a space where we can really sort of come together in unity, to find comfort, to find peace, if that's what we're looking for, but also really to make sense of what's going on in the world together. You'll see today, it will be a really interesting format. We'll have a wonderful conversation between two pretty incredible speakers who I consider mentors to myself. And they will provide their own perspectives on the idea of hope, on comfort, turning to community and faith in difficult times, and what that means, and sort of how to grapple with that. Just these perspectives are their perspectives, and don't necessarily represent the institutional perspective, but it is instead meant to sort of give you a model of how to sort of muddle through things and process difficult situations. So with that, the title of the session today is Discourses of Hope, Negotiating the Individual and Communal in Difficult Times. The way it's going to work, the format of today's session is really a conversation between Natasha and Murad. And what will happen is we will request all of you to please share your questions as they have these conversations. We will read then the questions that come up to Natasha and Murad, and they are so happy to sort of take your questions, share their perspectives on your questions, and give you some good feedback on how to maybe muddle through some of it. I also wanted to take this opportunity to really thank you all for being here. You know, it is a Sunday night, and I'm sure we have a couple of other things to be doing tonight, but we're really glad that you're joined us tonight for this conversation. I'm really excited to introduce you to Natasha. Natasha Hakamali Merchant is an assistant professor of multicultural education at the University of Washington, where she teaches courses in education and equity. Natasha, a proud student of the community college system, went on to pursue a master's in teaching, and after working as a social studies teacher, earned her PhD in education with a graduate certificate in feminist studies from the University of Washington in Seattle. Natasha has made important contributions to scholarship around the curricular experiences of Muslim students and their social studies teachers, and was recognized for her scholarship through a very prestigious social justice award. For the last decade, Natasha has been involved with Jamaati education in the US through delivery of WISE, pastoral care, young adult sessions, curriculum design, and professional development. And in the last term, Natasha also served as an ITHRA board member. I'm also very excited to introduce you to Murad Baidani. He currently serves as the communications chair, as well as a member of the board of trustees for the National Indian American Museum. And from 2015 to 2019, so the past 4 years, Murad served as the honorary secretary for ITHRA USA. And for 6 years prior to that, Murad served as the president of the Ismaili Council for the Midwest. Murad has also served as an allies, similar to Natasha, and as a teacher educator within the religious education system for well over 15 years. He's born in Calcutta and educated at St. Xavier's in Northwestern University. And Murad received his postgraduate degree from McCormick School of Engineering, Northwestern University, and has worked in the technology sector for over 2 decades. He lives in Glenview, Illinois, with his wife Farida and his 2 daughters. His oldest daughter recently graduated from the University of Chicago, and his younger daughter Sarah is a senior at the International Academy in Glenbrook South. Both really impressive bios. I'm really excited to hear this conversation, and again, we would love for all of you to be a part of it. So if you have questions, please share them in either the chat box or in the Q&A. we'll write down the questions and we'll be sure to share it with Natasha and Murad. And with that, I'll leave it to the two of you to start.
Great. Can everyone hear me? With everyone. So Murad Pai, this is a conversation and it seems strange to start any conversation without first asking, how are you doing right now? And what kinds of thoughts are preoccupying your mind these days?
Hey, Yali, everyone. Thanks, Natasha and Farhana. That was a lot. So I'll add two caveats at the very upfront. I have been such a failure in preventing my hands from touching my face, as we are all told. So I keep my homemade solution and bottle of sanitizer with me at all times. So don't emulate what I do. Follow your advisors from the health field. And then the second thing is that I'll be talking a lot more from my own personal perspective rather than institutional. And so I just wanted to share that it's not necessarily coming across from an institutional viewpoint or perspective, but rather something that's deeply personal to me. Yeah. So with that, Natasha, it's been quite an interesting few weeks for all of us. And as you know, I have been sort of soft quarantining myself for the past week. Lots of anxiety of what holds ahead, both from a financial standpoint, economic standpoint, and health standpoint. And just like everybody else, I am wasting a lot of energy through the constant updates on WhatsApp and social media. However, I was fortunate enough to work out of my home office for the past week. The last time I went out was last Sunday to vote in the primaries in Illinois. But I also look at some of the silver linings, if I may use that word. I mean, for the last 7 days, as a family, we have had breakfast, lunch, and dinner together. Started learning how to play chess with the family, unpacking our karaoke and singing late into the evening, and developed a good relationship with our neighbors as well by alternating grocery errands to reduce our exposure, each one of ours. But I've been thinking quite a bit about what we are all facing. And as you know, I love delving into the past for a sense of meaning, and also for a connection, for comfort, for hope. This weekend, as we all heard yesterday, we are not only celebrating Navroz, but we are also celebrating Miraj. And there is this particular period of time in the Prophet's life, 619, that is referred to as the year of sadness or sorrow. And this is the year when Bibi Khadija passes away. This is Bibi Khadija, peace be upon her, who is his source of comfort for 25 years of his life. And then his source of protection in that sense from a clan standpoint, Hazrat Abu Talib passes away. And so the Prophet makes a journey to a town called At-Taif to look for a tribal source to sort of work with his clan and for him, because now he's sort of persona non grata in Mecca. And it's interesting because he's refused access to the town. And so he's sort of forced to leave town, and he takes shelter in this orchard. And when he is in this orchard, he actually narrates a prayer. He prays, which is deeply personal, but also something that touches me a lot, where he says, quote, "O Lord, unto you do I complain of my frailty, lack of resources, and my insignificance before these people. O most merciful of the merciful, you are the Lord of the oppressed, and you are my Lord. If your anger is not against me, I have no worry, for your security encompasses everything. I seek protection in the light of your presence. In case your anger descends on me or your fury descends upon me, there is no other resource, no power, but in you. And I found this sort of really addressing sort of the humility of the prophet, peace be upon him, at a time of immense hardship. And you see that reflected in his words. And it also reminded me as I sort of delve into the past about the part in the dua that we read every day, Sajada Wajhi Ilaika. We talk about, I prostrate before you and I rely upon you. From you is my strength and you is my protection. And quite interestingly enough, within a few days of this experience of the prophet, he experiences the Miraj. So this weekend, in that sense, sort of made it a little bit more personal for me in terms of the hardships and what follows following that. But enough about what sort of my thoughts are. How have you been feeling? It's been a while since we had a long conversation. How have you been coping? What's going through your mind?
So I've also been facing a lot of anxiety on and off. I'll kind of forget and then I will remember, or my body will remind me in different ways. Even if my mind gets caught up with whatever TV show I'm biding my time, watching. But it's also been interesting because I've been working from home for a while and I find motivation very difficult to come by. And even though I have gobs of time, I'm finding that I'm losing myself a little bit. And I'm realizing that so much of my identity and the way I see myself is not only in my work, but the way I present my work to others and the feedback I get from them through these interactions. And that's really been muted since I'm not having many social interactions outside. And it really made me think about something I heard on a podcast, which said in our society today, we are human doings, we are not human beings. Because our entire value in our market-driven society is based on what we contribute to the economy and what is seen as a valuable contribution, what makes us visible, what makes us sort of interesting subjects and worthy subjects or contributors rather than those who are more invisible. And what I've also been noticing in this time is that those people who very often are not seen as valuable, quote unquote, to the economy or as valuable, those are actually the people who are most vulnerable, and not just during this time of this pandemic, but in fact, they are always the ones that are most vulnerable to sickness, to poverty, to loneliness, in many ways, to just being forgotten and not seen. So in this time of isolation, I've been thinking a lot about scarcity. I've been thinking a lot about what defines me in the social world and what defines each other, and also visibility. Because now we're in a situation where many of us are not visible. At the same time, I find myself almost addicted to the news, which it's almost this really, I'm aware, I have great self-awareness that listening to the news incessantly is probably not going to give me any more control, but somehow actively participating as a consumer of something is giving me a sense of normalcy, because that's also something I am having withdrawal from, and actively trying to resist, thinking about, where will I go eat? What kind of thing am I going to buy? What is that going to say about who I am? And these are ways that we're subconsciously constantly producing our identity and interacting with other people. And so what does it mean when all of that is taken away? And Muradbhai, I'm thinking so much about this prayer of the prophet. What is reality, right? If the divine is the only thing that is real and nothing else matters, it is the only resource. I mean, that was an interesting translation, an interesting word to use, that you are the only resource. If we're talking about resources here, which we're all really worried about and preoccupied by, if she is the only resource, then at a time like this, when we're thinking about scarcity and identity and who we are, I've been thinking a lot about, what are those resources that bring me comfort, that keep me in a trance, that keep me in an illusion. As you know, I am very ignorant of our Ginans, but one thing I've gained from many of them is that they talk, and they don't mince words when they talk about the illusion that we're all living in. And these were written in periods where we don't have the same kind of materialism, perhaps, that we do today, but we have these attachments, even attachments to one another. So when thinking about what is visible, what is invisible, what do we hold on to, what do we grasp onto, I'm grappling, and there's a lot of quiet time, and there's still a lot of distractions that I'm indulging in, and I'm realizing that perhaps I need to quiet that down and attend to a greater resource that is never scarce.
Yeah. So no, I'm glad you are doing all right, and these are thoughts that we all have. And interestingly enough, sometimes we feel that, hey, am I the only one who is experiencing this? But others feel the pressures of life and what we are hearing, and that adds more to sort of this um, sense of, maybe it's the wrong word, but since our topic is based on it, um, leading towards lack of hope. Um, and it's a good thing that you and all of us have this sort of a social circle that allows us to sort of think through um, concerns that we may have. So let me ask you, how do you sort of then look at hope in a time like this? How do you sort of break it down in your own life?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think sometimes hope for me feels like it gets conflated with a kind of American optimism. This sense that things are just going to get better and better because time moves on, and somehow that means we get better or we improve, or rather the external conditions improve. I'm not sure if I think that's true. And I too like to look at history for examples of whether we really are progressing or if we're just in struggles of different phases, right? In different times, and we are just human, and that's sort of the constant, is the struggle. So when I think about hope, my questions are, hope for what? Is it hope for things to get better? Is it hope for things to go back to a kind of normal? Hope for what? And I think that if our hope is hinged in the external circumstances changing, and then it becomes like a bargain, right? Like I'm having this hope because I believe it will get better externally. But I keep thinking about this hadith, which is so powerful, and it's a Sahih hadith that stuck with me, which is, even if the end of the day, even if the resurrection is upon you and you know that, but you have a seed, you have a sapling in your hand, plant that. And
That's
that,
brilliant.
it's
Love it.
so powerful because it really shows that, at least for me, the way I've taken it, is that you don't have hope and you don't do things just for the promise of things to get better or an outcome that you will see and enjoy, but in fact you do it because that's what it means to submit. It is your orientation, or rather hope is an orientation of the heart rather than a kind of bargain or emotion that you use as a currency. To really think about, how do we sort of become hope and spread that without necessarily demanding or expecting that that is going to manifest in one way or another, because after all, is that not what it means to be Muslim, is to submit and say, I don't actually know.
Yeah.
I have very little knowledge.
Yeah, no, great points, great points. And I just wanted to piggyback on a few things that you shared. As I look at the Prophet's prayer, and I look at how hope, um, for me, for the longest time, was just simply steadfastness in faith, becomes sort of this anchor of hope for me. I read an interesting sort of a story from a Catholic priest, Father Anthony de Mello, who actually had a parish out in Bombay when I was growing up. And he basically narrates that, one of his neighbors decides that he's going to work on the best garden ever, plant all kinds of flowers and everything else in it. And after a couple of years of trying, he can't seem to get rid of these small areas with dandelions on them. And he's like, I used all kind of weed killers, nothing works. What do I do? So he sends, in frustration, a letter to the municipal corporation. And the corporation sends a response back to the letter where he says, what can I do? And the corporation responds saying, learn to love the dandelions. And I often think about that story as I start thinking about things that I may not be able to change. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged then to change our own selves. And in that sense, hope then takes a slightly different role. It's become sort of one of the things that we use as a lens for all of our experiences. And it gives it a different shade and helps us sort of work out whatever the case may be, or whatever the condition may be, as we are seeing it right now. There is one way of looking at it that I sort of just go ahead and get everything off from the shelf, clear it up, and I block myself into my home or into my villa or whatever it is with rations for the next 12 years. Yeah. On the other hand, I could also look at it is, how do I add meaning to it? I add meaning to it by saying, look, yes, I am going to quarantine myself to protect myself, but also because this is an equal opportunity virus, we are also helping others not get infected. So this whole thing about breaking the chain or breaking the link, so that is another way in which we could think about how we are experiencing the world today. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because the virus is something that, I know there are lots of push-pull factors, but it's something that is so indiscriminate, as you're saying. Everything around it isn't, right? So even something like testing, which is so infuriating, we see that celebrities are getting tested with a quick turnaround, but their crews who are also exposed can't seem to get a test. So we see this sort of inequity everywhere, but not necessarily with the virus in terms of who can get it. Their outcomes and all of that, of course, and access to healthcare, it's revealing a lot. But what I think is so interesting about this sort of like natural virus being so indiscriminate is it's so human, right? Like the suffering that we are going through, even the way that they're thinking that we're getting it is through of course, we're not health experts, but what I hear from my hours of news is through these droplets that come from us. I mean, it is so close and human and funky and just like visceral that it is like the most basic thing, stripping us down of all of the kinds of social nonsense and ways that we have taken power to divide ourselves in such a way that it's showing us if we don't take care of one another, we really are doomed. And there's no other way to think about it. And they like that's just the reality. When there's nothing else, there is the truth, right?
Yeah. No, those are great points. Great points. Do we want to sort of pause for a bit and maybe take some of the questions from the online forum?
Yes, I think that would be. If you don't mind, I'll just read a couple of the comments that have been made so far. Sonia Bhatia has shared, you can't change the direction of the wind, but you can adjust your sails. just wanted to sort of share with both Murad and Natasha if you had any comments about these quotes about hope.
Natasha, you want to?
No, I mean,
Any thoughts?
I think it's wisdom. You know, I think the how-to piece is somewhat trickier. And I also see a comment that I hope we attend to about loss and keeping hope alive and sort of how to do that. There is so much loss. I mean, I think of so many people that I don't know right now who are on this call, who are not on this call, who are suffering. And then, you know, hearing the news from today and yesterday that now the first couple of cases have been confirmed in Gaza, and thinking about what it's like for refugee displaced populations, people within the prison system, people who are, you know, living in cages, like all of these situations. What does that actually mean when we're really facing the abject suffering? How do we sort of think about hope in that case? And how do we make that sort of an orientation in our heart without, and what is the place for grief? I think that's also a question that's really important for us as an Ismaili community, because, you know, when we have someone pass away or we have a difficult situation, one of the first things we say is shukr alhamdulillah. And sometimes that's hard. That's really hard to hear sometimes, because it doesn't always leave space for the person to have their suffering held.
Yeah.
And so another reason why I think the example you shared, Murad Bhai, about the Prophet's year of sadness, and even stories from the lives of our prophets and imams where they have faced hardship and it has impacted them.
Yeah.
It's to be taken, you know, it's to be attended to, and it is to pause, and not everything can just be a growth opportunity. Not everything just fits into a narrative of, and then I learned from it and it became better. You know, sometimes it just becomes part of you.
No, it's a great point, and we should recognize that, you know, as a human, I'm no psychologist or, but just understanding and experiencing life, you realize that we are not always going to have a high, right? There's always going to be a seesaw between hope and at times despondency as well. There is going to be sorrow. There is going to be discomfort in our lives. And then so how do you then bring meaning into what you may be experiencing? And that for me is, at least I felt important. One of my favorite authors of all time is Viktor Frankl. I don't know, all of us probably have heard of him, having been a survivor of the Holocaust and then becoming one of the preeminent um, person who studied the mind. And then he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks about that in some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. And so as we start looking at all of these um, thoughts, cases, you know, um, today it's COVID-19, but we also have a lot of other challenges as humans. I mean, we still are in many places denial about climate change. And then so sometimes it feels it's hopeless, but then how do you find meaning in what you do to infuse hope into what you do? So Farhana, with that, I think we should try for, or so I shouldn't say that, but we should sort of also give others an opportunity for whatever questions that they may have that they would want to discuss.
In addition to some of the comments that have already been read, I just wanted to sort of highlight a couple of more. There's a question here by Shamsha Malik, building on closure of Jamaat Khana. Any thoughts on what can be done for our parents that are living alone and listening to negative news? And in the questions that we had actually received before the webinar, there were questions about the students as well, similar to this, and students who are going through a very sort of isolated and lonely time because they don't have Jamaat Khana as a space to congregate.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's um, a, a tough one from a parent standpoint, who, as I was talking about, look at the Jamaat Khana as a space where becomes their anchor, right, for the entire day. Um, though I will add that many of our parents have also experienced sort of the kind of sacrifice and extended periods of times of uh, challenges and call it discomforts as well in their lives, particularly for those who would have come from parts of the world where they had to leave, parts of the world that have experienced um, curfews, wars, and other kinds of natural and man-made calamities. Um, and I found them to be a bit more reflective about what they are experiencing. Having said that, um, there are opportunities for us to find ways to engage them in forums like these, in some form of a virtual sort of groups. I know from a social welfare board standpoint that iCare has been making quite a lot of headway in this area. And many of the other sister institutions may be also working with them at this point in time to provide that engagement with many senior members in our family, in our Jamaat. Natasha, I would let you sort of take a stab at the one for the college students that Farhana just brought up. Yeah.
Can you rephrase the question or say it again?
So there's a lot of isolation being faced by college students. They're having to, and uncertainty as well with the lack of understanding of what's happening with internships and jobs. And the question was, in the prior to the webinar, the question was, what can be done to support them in particular?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like this question is more about resources in terms of what can be done by our own institutional boards. I think I'm really personally impressed with the speed at which a lot of us are putting out helpful ways for folks to connect. And so I think that that is one way that people can be supported in terms of things like the loss of opportunities like attending graduation, things that are happening in people's personal lives, having to have, you know, part of your college experience or part of your senior year or something like that be online, and kind of not having things the way that one imagined it, losing connection. It's sort of like losing hopes and dreams or having to reshape them, as well as the isolation. And for many of us, being home with our family is really joyous, but for many of us, regardless of whatever age we are, it's actually also a difficult negotiation. And I think that's really important. There are many of us who are in unhealthy home lives in terms of violent situations as well. And we know that these times are difficult for more than just health reasons from COVID-19, but also interpersonal violence. And so I think checking in on each other is the best thing we can do regardless of the situation. So there are going to be interventions and things that we can do programmatically, but I think just making sure to kind of go through an inventory and think about who are the Jamaati members that I kind of know may not have a bunch of people calling them or may not have a bunch of people reaching out, and how can I do that to, you know, figure out how to cook something together or have a chat or watch something together, whatever it is. I think having a way of thinking about that, not just my own family and my people, but also who do we think, whether they're entire family units or individuals who might be feeling even more isolated and could really use some support when isolation becomes, you know, very uncomfortable and potentially also dangerous?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head is where we collectively need to start looking at is how do we address engagement across uh, all the demographic profiles, and not necessarily just, I mean, of course this is a faith-based forum, but also within our neighborhoods. I mean, I live in a large sort of community setting, and having conversations with our neighbors in terms of where is it that we can assist each other, providing that uh, help. So, you know, earlier when we were talking about hope, and we talked about hope being sort of anchored through faith, we talked about hope as a result of our experiences and the lens we use to address um, our needs of the time. But also, each one of us becomes an instrument of hope for the other. And I want us to sort of also think about it. You know, we are going to have a conversation for probably 35, 40 minutes. But at the end of the day, this is the larger conversation that we also should be having with each other. Where can I play a role? And what becomes my responsibility in this time? Because this is a time that is probably not being felt or experienced by many of us growing up in the United States. And so it is a time that we need to be mindful of the challenges that we do need to overcome. Yeah. Farhana?
There is another question, and if you can, this is particularly about the idea of despondency.
Mm-hmm.
This outbreak has taught us a great deal about seeking to learn from others' challenges and best practices. In the US context, it can be argued that exceptionalism espoused by governing institutions has led to negligence and inequity in access to vital resources. Where can we find hope if key leadership have made it clear that evolution in the interests of those most vulnerable is only as important as reinforcing existing power structures?
That's a tough one. Um, we are all experiencing sort of this sense of, um, you know, probably maybe a false sense of security in some sense. Um, Thinking, hey, we are in the United States. We should be able to have enough ventilators. We should be able to have enough masks. We should be able to have enough gowns for our health professionals in the front line. We should have enough tests. But one thing that we have seen is a country like South Korea um, has been able to administer tests way beyond our means here. Again, not being a health professional, but just intaking a lot of news cycle. Um, However, that still does not necessarily mean that we have to be despondent about it, um, because the end of the day, um, we are also a faith-based tradition, and there's a lot of solace that comes um, uh, from having sort of uh, this verse from the dua that I was talking about earlier that we recite in the first part every single day, right? That, oh Lord, you are my source of comfort. When we say in our first part of dua, sajada wajhi laika wa tawakkaltu alaika, right? We recite it every single day, 3 times a day. Um, and then so that is a source of hope. Um, and also the source of hope comes, at least for me, from the way that I look at my role in all of this. Um, do I become a source of comfort for others? For each one of our roles. Yes, we may not be able to produce the events needed, but you know, a lot of uh, health professionals actually talk about how do you, because human mind doesn't think about sort of events in a chronological sense in that timeline. It's not linear. And then so prayers then allow us to become mindful of the present itself. So when I actually look and get really anxious after watching a lot of news, I have to step back and say, where am I today? What is my position? What is my concern? Um, is it really something that, as of right now, I should become extremely despondent about? Or are there things that I can do to make meaning out of what I may be experiencing? And oftentimes, those are some of the tools that, at least for me, have worked to basically look around me and still see some silver linings, some blessings in what um, we have been fortunate to have, right? Um, it's a tough time. It's a tough time. Don't want to take that away from it. But we also have to start looking at how do we become an instrument that addresses some of these challenges. Natasha, thoughts?
I mean, I think I'm still unpacking the question. It was, it was a good one and heavy. And I think I might be a bit cynical in my response, but I don't put too much trust in power structures that are accountable first and foremost to those who have the most money. And this is, we all know that this is how things run. So I think that the case of the most vulnerable is always going to be a case that has to be fought, that will be fought by the minority of people. That, in my, at least from what I have seen, that is for me the greatest lesson of our collective history. And that's where I seek inspiration too. So there is power in being subversive. And I think that is where I call up faith, to say, in what ways can we together be subversive to help and do the work we need to do with integrity, to submit and inculcate this hope within our community, such that it is an agentive and action-oriented hope, rather than one that waits for something to happen or waits for a government structure to somehow change its nature, which, the government in this country started based on land grabbing and oppression and slavery. So it's not going to necessarily just one day change with some progressive laws. At least as a student of education and a teacher of education, we see that there are movements of progress, but then there's also regress, right? So the more we see that things are privatized and there are interests of those who have a need to consolidate their power, that is just the setup. In my mind, we at least know what we're dealing with. So the question is not so much about becoming despondent. For me, the question is, as a faith community, how can we make sure we're getting our agenda and the imam's agenda pushed through the official channels, the community-based channels, and really infiltrating our agenda of justice and our agenda of peace and equity and freedom internally within the soul work that we have to do, but also through our actions. And so COVID-19 in the US, abroad, this is a situation right now. We have structural barriers, and Warda had a comment as well on here about, it's COVID-19 right now, but hunger and loss of housing and all of these things are constant issues, right? The level of starvation, the income inequity, even people within the US, income inequity of countries around the world, this is constant. So I feel we always need to be at high alert, and we
Vigilant,
cannot take our eyes off the target, because the moment we think things have, improved, they will then proliferate like a cancer. So we need to constantly be doing that work. And this is the work for now in this moment.
The only thing that I would add as a caveat here is that oftentimes when we look at all of this, it's hard not to become hopeless. But we also have to start thinking about that, um, you know, if we start taking a lot of this suffering, because suffering is relative, um, in the sense that it's almost, at least for our experiencing of it from what we hear um, and see in the news channel, etc., it's almost like an analogy of gas, right? You put it in a room and it keeps on expanding. It keeps on expanding and it fills up the entire chamber. And then so we have to be mindful of sort of taking that time out, of being out from that chamber as well, and start thinking about how we also look at silver linings across the board as compared to allowing the suffering to expand in our minds, right? For our own mental health, for our own sake, we have to be able to also look at how do we make sense of what we are seeing, and are there meanings and silver linings that I can draw from it. So yeah, Farhana, it's a great conversation. Should we continue on? We are at the 9 o'clock mark. Thoughts? Um, Any other questions that you are seeing pop up?
There are many questions that
Okay.
and I'm afraid that we won't be able to get to all of them as much as we would like to. If actually just one last
Yeah.
point that I think was brought up that I'd love for both of you to sort of end off with.
Okay.
This idea that I think this is something that I've heard a lot, and I think would be sort of an interesting way to sort of end the conversation. I feel like many Smileys are going through their normal lives, getting together with their friends and others not within their home, and then posting about it on social media. Given that we're all in this together, it hurts all of us when that happens. And this sort of goes to the conversation you were having prior about this idea of social responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there? Can you just a quick couple of points, and then we'll.
Can I clarify the question quickly? Sorry. So this is a question about people are talking about what's happening and then they're posting those conversations. And then the kind of hurtful part is that it becomes exclusive.
I think it was more, if I correct me if I'm wrong, from what I understood it to be, is that there is this lack of um, uh, the urgency and the feeling of being socially responsible for each other by still continuing to um, gather, meet together, despite the ideas of physical distancing um, to address this pandemic that we are experiencing. Um, I'll be honest, it's something that uh, irritates me to see. There is this sense of common good that we all sort of buy into as citizens of a neighborhood, a community, a country, as a family, and um, the idea of pursuing sort of uh, common good that allows us to mutually accommodate each other and make the society work for each one of us as compared to for individuals. I know it's sort of a utopian way for me for looking at it, but at the end of the day, these are the aspirations that we have for the society. So that my social responsibility is to make sure that what I do does not bring harm to others in the pursuit of my own interest. Yeah. So, however, I would want to close with a couple of thoughts. At the end of the day, um, um, we are a faith tradition, and so as I think about um, challenges that we face, unprecedented in nature that we may not have experienced here. Um, for me, the recourse goes back to seeking God's help and support. In addition to doing whatever it takes from a human standpoint, um, we use our prayer for forgiveness, for mercy. We also use it for peace and guidance. And Surah 2, Surah Bakar, Ayat 186 sort of states, addressing the Prophet, saying, "O Prophet, when my servants ask you about me, then tell them, I am indeed very close. I answer the prayer of the supplicant who calls me." There's this beautiful story of Bibi Khadija that I wanted to share. In the traditions and in the Sirat of the Prophet, there is this incident when the tradition states that Hazrat Jibrail is visiting the Prophet. And as the visit comes to an end, Bibi Khadija enters the room. And the Prophet shares with her that Hazrat Jibrail is here. And Hazrat Jibrail says, "O Khadija, O Prophet, let Khadija know that uh, uh, the Almighty has sent salam to Bibi Khadija." And Bibi Khadija's response is something that we are all very familiar with, and we recite in our second part of dua, Allahumma ya Maulana anta salam. It says, "O Prophet, please send these prayers and greetings through Hazrat Jibrail. O Allah, you are the peace, and from you is the peace, and to you returns the peace. O our Lord, give us a life of peace and usher us in the abode of peace." Yeah.
Natasha?
Well, I think to go back to the question, which was about feeling really frustrated to see that there are people who are still socializing with others, right? I'm getting the question right. I guess it's so absurd, that I couldn't even understand the question. But in fact, I too am with you, and I fear that I'm not dealing well with the people in my life who are not taking this, what I think is seriously, right? Arguments like, well, there's only so much one can do and things like that. And well, I did this because I wanted to, and I am using moderation, like this is not a time for moderation. However, I don't know what strategy is best and what it will take, but I think what it really shows me is that we are all not on the same page to begin with about what common good means and what social responsibility means and what our role is for each one of us. So when a crisis hits, we're not all of that mentality. And when I think about it, how could we be? Because that's really not the way we're socialized, and it's not the world we live in, right? You watch out for yourself and you get your own back. And so it's a little bit naive to assume that all of a sudden, within a couple of weeks, people are going to be thinking about limiting their own movements for some invisible people that they're going to be saving potentially, who they may or may not even know. So I think that is quite abstract, and it speaks to the work we need to do now and forever, which is to make sure that no human existence can ever become obscure, and that our humanity always needs to be so real to each one of us. Our feelings, our emotions, our health, the consequences of our quality of life, these things need to be very personal to each one of us. And so I think that the work, I think we're doing well, and we're not perfect, and we need to remind the people in our lives that this is not okay. Whatever way you can do that, guilt trips, great. You know, like use everything in your emotional arsenal, I think. At the end of the day, everyone controls their own actions and behaviors, but I think that the work needed to start a while ago, and we have been doing it. And let's think about what we're teaching our young. Let's think about how we're, you know, beyond our history, how we're thinking about character development for our young as well as each other during this time. And if I could leave with some sort of food for thought or reflection question, is just for everybody to sort of think about what hope means and how attached to certain outcomes we might be for our hope to be alive and thriving. And is it possible? What would it look like for each of us to have hope without it being attached to something external? So thank you so much. This has been a really fun conversation to engage with. And Farhana, if I'm correct, we'll try to do this with different speakers in the future.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I will say, Farhana, is that great conversations, and when we have conversations that challenge you to think, those are the ones worth having, because you all come in with our own ideas and understanding, and conversations like this help broaden your worldview as well. So I appreciate the opportunity to have this done in front of a large audience. Really enjoyed it, Natasha. Thank you for the conversations. Yeah.
And thank you both for being so transparent and for being so honest about your thoughts and your feelings and your perspectives. I think we all grew from your insights. And Natasha, to your point, yes, inshallah, we will have more of these on different topics in the future. So thank you everyone for joining. I know it's getting late on the East Coast, so we'll let everyone on the East Coast get some rest. And inshallah we'll connect again soon.
Yali.
Yali Madad.
Malali Madad.
Yeah.